these aren't cheap remodels in this neighborhood.
So you're thinking about buying a house in Land Park in the Sacramento area. We're with Dan Loesch. He's going to talk about 6 things you need to be aware of if you're thinking about moving to Land Park, thinking about buying a home here, if you're thinking about selling a home. This is a very specific area. Let's get started.
We're here on our 11th Avenue project with D&J Design Build, working on a joint venture. It's a full house remodel. We're going to talk a little bit about what you're going to find out on these houses when you buy them. There's a lot of hidden surprises. So today is going to be a great episode where we're talking about what to get into before you buy that house.
Okay, so let's just jump right into it. We're in Land Park. It's hot. We're actually in Land Park. This is one of your jobs you're doing right now too, right?
Yeah, right on the park. You can see the view right behind me. That's Land Park proper. So
I love it. Okay, so let's go with number one.
Number one would be small rooms. So in these houses, they're built in the 1930s and 40s. So you have a lot of segmented, galley kitchens, really small bathrooms with 30-inch hallways. And so now your modern buyer wants to do the open concept, right? We have a lot more appliances in a kitchen, a typical kitchen. It's not just an ice box in the garage, right? In the 1920s, I don't think they had refrigerators back then. So you had a much smaller area and you had probably 6 rooms where now we would have 3. So oftentimes we're taking out a lot of bearing walls and we're widening up to meet today's modern needs in these old homes.
Okay. Now, one of the things too, a lot of people might ask, like, why am I going with an older home? Why does that work for me? It's like, the thing is in Sacramento, 90% of the houses here are tract homes. So when you have an area like Land Park or like an area like East Sacramento or whatnot, that you have these very much older 1920s, 1930s homes, these are very coveted homes and they're coveted area. Like Land Park is probably one of the staple areas. A lot of people might not know about Land Park, but it's close to UC Davis Medical Center, it's close to downtown, and it's hard to find a house here, right? So people's their dream is like, I want to live in Land Park. I want something that's not tract. I want something close to downtown. This is where you go. And this is why people spend money in remodels. Like how much do people normally spend in remodeling a Land Park house? What do you think?
I would say typically no less than $100,000 because they're typically gutting out an entire kitchen. They're taking out bearing walls, like we were saying. And so you need to get down to studs when you start doing a remodel in Land Park because you don't know what's there, right? You may have had 4 or 5 remodels in the past in the last 80 years, and who knows what they did. Maybe they tied into some old faulty wiring. And so you really want to make sure whatever room you're doing it to the fullest extent.
So older homes, older framing. Let's go to number 2. What is that all about?
Back 80, 90 years ago, framing standards were different. Right. You don't see a lot of projects like this one that we're working on. They had irregular spacing on some of their framing. They just kind of slapped up some rafters. And then there's also a lot of settlement in the Land Park area. The soil's very soft, right? So you have issues where the floor is kind of like a roller coaster. And in order to address that, you really have to take everything down past the subfloor. You need to address the framing issues and get everything so it's nice and level. And you're going to have to deal with that anytime you buy an old home. It's the raised foundations, they'll tend to settle a little bit, and you'll have one area that has a dip in it. And then also with the roof, you have issues with that. And if you're doing an addition, you have to plane into it. So you'll see that on this project that we're working on. We had a lot of issues tying into that old framing with the new. So you really need to have an expert framer or someone that knows what they're doing if they're going to be doing any remodels on these old homes.
Well, another thing also to mention is that when you say $100,000, $200,000 to remodel some of these homes, Land Park is an area historically that has kept its value. Mm-hmm. It's like a coveted area. So it's one of those things where it's hard to find anything under $1 million in Land Park. Closer you get to the park, like here, it's even more coveted. So
yeah, I would say maybe most of these homes on the park are going for 1.4, 1.5. Some of them are $2 million homes. People are putting upwards of $500,000 into the homes. They're doing complete guts. Also, you've seen additions done in this neighborhood that are gone up on the second story. Those weren't second stories when they were built 100 years ago. And so you look at every 2-story in Land Park, you could almost guarantee that had been an addition at some point. So people are putting a lot of money into these homes.
Well, the other thing too that I noticed too is certain areas you see the fix and flips, right? Like the primer white paint, the really, really, really tiny LVP. But when I show houses in Land Park that are maybe remodeled or anything too, people spend a lot of money to remodel houses. Even if they're going to flip them, they dump a lot of money because they know they can get their money back in this specific area, correct?
Yeah, I would say you're not going to get the handyman special out in this neighborhood. You're going to see a lot of yard signs out with reputable contractors. You're going to start seeing, waterfall edges on the countertops, everything granite quartz, high-end tile finishes on your showers and your bathrooms. these aren't cheap remodels in this neighborhood.
Okay. Now, another thing for you too is we are in Land Park, but your business is all around the Sacramento area, Placer County, correct? So,
Correct.
so I mean, like this is one job, but like if someone wants to reach out to you, wants to talk to you a little bit about ADUs, contracting, I mean, you're kind of like an all around the Sacramento County, Placer County kind of guy, correct?
Yeah. We have obviously neighborhoods like this where we spend most of our projects in, but we work out in El Dorado Hills and Granite Bay and kind of all around the Tri-County area, Yolo County.
Okay, so let's go into another big thing. Because they're older houses, some of the newer houses have great insulation, they're modern, like energy efficient. Like how, as far as in Land Park, how are we talking about like the insulation? Do you have insulation issues? Is that something you have to address normally with people here?
Yeah, many of these homes, especially the homes built in the 20s and 30s, we will see zero insulation in the exterior walls. And typically you'll see some blown-in insulation that was done later in the attic, but that's only going to be so sufficient, right? So back in the day, it was essentially just stucco your exterior walls and then light up the fireplace when it got cold, right? Well, now with all the energy that we're using and your HVAC system, you're going to want to make sure that you insulate your exterior walls. And the only way to do that on a project like in Land Park is to completely take all of the exterior drywall off or the plaster off and then put new bats in. There's some systems where they cut holes in every stud bay and they shoot a hose through there, but that's going to be very costly because you're going to have to re-stucco and waterproof over all that. So you're better off doing it on the inside. So essentially, you're going to be taking down whatever rooms to the studs, and you really, really should be checking at least maybe with a home inspection or at the very beginning of a job, if you can do a thermal cam and see if there's any insulation in those exterior walls, because that's going to save you a ton of money on your energy bill.
Okay, so another thing too with these houses, because they're older, of course, electrical needs to be updated, plumbing needs to be updated. So if someone's coming into Land Park and they're going to be buying a home that's older, maybe hasn't been gutted or remodeled for a while, is that something that's commonplace in Land Park?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's great about Land Park is most of the homes are on raised foundations, right? So you can get a good peek at what the existing plumbing situation looks like. And that's going to be really important when you buy that house before you pull the trigger on it to say, hey, do I need a whole house repipe? And if that has old galvanized water supply lines, chances are it's corroded and you have very little water pressure. The city water here is great. You should be getting awesome water pressure in your Land Park home. So if it's barely coming out of that faucet, you know that you're going to need to do a repipe. Also, the electrical, you're going to most likely have a Zinsco panel if that hasn't been upgraded, and that could be a fire hazard.
Okay.
You got knob and tube wiring. Sometimes over the course of 40, 50 years, they've tied into the knob and tube wiring, and that can be a fire hazard. It's only a single insulated line on that, so you don't have that extra measure of protection that you do with today's modern wiring.
Well, that's the thing too. I mean, when you have an older home, I mean, safety hazard protocols have kind of updated. And when you have an older home, that's one of the things you need to be aware of. In fact, some of the people who've probably never remodeled and never updated their homes, they should be looking towards that because, like faulty wiring, faulty all that stuff
Well,
too,
what's
correct?
great about a permitted remodel is you have an inspector looking over your work, correct? So back 50, 60 years ago, maybe they didn't get something permitted and they did a junction box somewhere that's buried. Well, that could be a fire hazard, right? We've seen wire nut connections in the attic that shouldn't be there right next to flammable insulation.
Yeah.
And I mean, one arc and you could have your entire house sparked up. Right, these houses don't have fire sprinklers in them, and so we really want to make sure that we track all the wiring. You have at least some record of a whole house rewire and a whole house repipe to consider before you're buying. That way, you're going to be into it another $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 in just those two items.
So another thing too is, and one of the things that like I it's not my cup of tea, but the crawl space, raised foundations, like what are we talking about as far as like the ratio? Like what does that look like here?
So I've seen very few homes on slabs in Land Park. Almost every home I've seen has been a raised foundation, which has its pros and cons, right? Because you can maintain your plumbing. You can replace your plumbing without having to remove the finishes. You don't have to jackhammer out an area of the slab to get to if there's a leak or some type of an issue, right? In the modern homes where it's a slab, you have that if, oh, shoot, water's permeating up, my LVP is starting to buckle. Well, now you got to replace all of your LVP, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, maybe there's a leak. Okay, well, we see something growing in the crawl space. Maybe, some water's getting to it. So there are advantages. The disadvantages are accessibility, right? Now you're going up a whole 12, 13 inches. You might have a step in the front of your house, right? So maybe if you're in a wheelchair, you have mobility issues, that raised foundation is not going to be the easiest to get up into from your driveway, right?
Okay. Oh, one thing to note too, I'm wearing these glasses because the sun's in my eyes, so I do apologize for anyone. I'm not cool. I'm not anything. It's just that we're getting a little bit of a glare here, so I apologize for that ahead of time. And we are here in Land Park. I mean, Land Park, it is just staple. I mean, it is like Sacramento. It is like, you're close to everything, and it's just so beautiful. I mean, I'm looking at the park right now. It reminds me of like kind of like a little Golden Gate Park. The house is like, it's set back. I mean, if you're someone from the Bay Area, you know what I mean, and you want that like non-track kind of feel, like Land Park, you should definitely check out. It's really, really fun here.
It's a true community. We'll do a remodel and we'll see people out there, a mom's group with the strollers doing yoga in the park, and we'll see. There's a 4th of July parade coming up next week. A true community. Everyone knows everyone here. You talk to people, and it's like, oh, he lives on that street. My best friend grew up there, and if you're looking for that true like Americana feeling, you're gonna get it here in this neighborhood.
Well, the other thing too about you specifically is the fact that we wanted to do something on site, because a lot of people come on videos and be like, I'm a good contractor, I'm a good builder, whatever, and you don't really know what they're all about. So like during this video, guys, you're gonna see some B-roll of the jobs Dan has been doing right here in this house, some Land Park as well too, and this is like first person stuff. So not only are you going to say like, hey, Dan talks a good game, which you do, and you're great at it, but he also walks the walk. And it's hard in this day and age to find a contractor that's reputable, that like is doing stuff in areas like Land Park, which is one of the highest price per square foot in the area. And so that's one of the things I love about you specifically, is that you're an encyclopedia about building. You do ADUs, you work all over the place, you do luxury, you do custom, you do everything underneath the sun. And I think for a lot of people moving into the area, if they have ADU questions, if they're thinking about building a luxury home or anything too, it's great to have someone like you that not only talks the talk, but also walks the walk. So I thank you for taking the time for this interview and to talk a little bit about your projects that you're on and everything about Land Park. This is kind of cool. Okay, so here's an interesting one. Okay, so lot size, right? Everyone loves coming to Sacramento, getting that resort style home, getting that whole like, I want that big, huge backyard. I want that 7,000 monster square foot house just for me and my wife, which is a little weird. But that's what they're looking for. So when people come to Land Park, what we've noticed is the lots are very long, right? I'll give you a little fact of this one before we get started. In Charleston, they used to do that because of the tax. Taxes would be measured based on how long, how like wide the house was, and so they built very, very long. But in Sacramento and Land Park, it tends to kind of be something like that as well too. Houses tend to be long, like the lot sizes are very long. What can you tell us about that?
Well, before we start a project, we have to do the due diligence of looking at old plat maps from the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and you see they're all handwritten and almost like a calligraphy, right? And they've and they show all the homes, and each home has a 40-foot wide lot by 150 or 120 foot long, massive lots that way, right? So they're very repetitive in that sense, but there's also some custom, bigger lots, but you're going to be, as a rule of thumb, a very deep lot. So if you're going to be building an addition out in Land Park, you're going to be building it in the far backyard or maybe in the front yard, you have some room, and you're not going to be able to build out so much, right? But you may have a driveway with a detached garage that was built for a Model A width, right? And so you can do an ADU out of a garage conversion that we commonly do, right? So just expect that when you buy that house, it's going to be very rare to get a wide lot out in Land Park, and possibly because of that tax reason that you talked about. Maybe in the 1950s, it was advantageous for builders to do that.
Yeah, one of the things about Land Park too is, it's difficult if you've got an Escalade, if you got a Suburban, to bring it into those little garages, right?
Yeah.
One thing before we get on to our next topic, but I want to talk to you a little bit about this. Okay, so you get someone who's basically got a bigger car, and they're like, you know what, I'm okay not having a garage. That space behind it, the little garage space. I've seen people do ADUs, seen people do like offices. What is the most common thing that people do with that like little garage that is back in the lot?
Right now, I would say working from home. I would say they need a home office that's separate from, with mobile work you have, or remote work, you have a husband who might be needing a home office and a wife, right? And they can't be doing a Zoom meeting in the same room. These are typically smaller homes in Land Park. This home that is behind you right now is a very large home. It's a 3,500 square foot home roughly. But most of the homes you'll see out here are 1,000 square feet, 900 square feet. And so you need that space for a home office or something, just accessory or guests, right, coming out. And so that's what we're seeing, is it's not necessarily for rental income as much as it is, hey, we love this neighborhood. Let's stay here and have a little bit more room.
I've actually seen people kind of gate off the entire like side driveway and use it and convert it into like a nice backyard, side yard area, and it tails ends in like that, you know, the ADU in the back, and they open it up a little bit too, which I think is really nice.
You know, you also mentioned, you know, skinny streets and things like that.
Yeah,
Back
yeah.
in the day, you know, they had smaller cars, and I would say if you were to compare East Sac with Land Park with getting, you know, accessible, these streets are much wider. You don't have all of the hospital parking that you do there, and you don't have issues like you do in East Sac. And so
Okay.
for me, you know, it's East Sac or Land Park for a lot of different buyers. But I would, if you have an issue with parking, or I would look at Land Park before I would look at East Sacramento.
Well, that's the funny thing. A lot of people are like, I'm looking at either East Sac or Land Park, but they're very specific. People
Yeah.
don't realize as much. And sometimes people work with the wrong realtor or the wrong people who don't really sell in this area, and they just don't know. The other thing too is like, it's very street specific in Land Park as in East Sacramento.
Yes.
Each street is different. And like, if you see a house and you're like, huh, that house is like 2 million, but like 4 blocks away, it's like, you know, 1.2, there's reasons for it. And you should definitely work with someone who can explain those to you, because it can be a little confusing. You know what I mean?
Well, East Sac, I know they have a major parade also on 4th of July on 41st Street,
Yep.
right? So 41st Street has and also the Fab 40s at Christmas time, right?
Absolutely.
So if you're on 41st Street, that's different than 39th.
Oh yeah,
right?
100%. What is a Fab 40s, thrifty 30s? Which honestly, give me a house on the 30s.
Yeah.
I'm okay.
I'll take that.
I'll take it. Okay, so you're in an interior of a Land Park house, and people are going like plaster versus drywall.
Yeah.
What do you do?
So back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, they were transitioning from the old lath and plaster, which is almost like a stucco, right? It has a metal reinforcing, and then a plaster coating over the top. And then they moved to this wallboard product that had little perforated holes in it, and they would plaster over that. And now, I think in the 1950s and 60s, they started using drywall, which we commonly have in our homes now. It's much easier to
Right.
install. And so what you're going to run into these homes is you may not know, you know, until you start tearing things out. Do I have, you know, that wafer wallboard plaster? Do I have an old traditional plaster? Like on this project behind you, we have a plaster ceiling, which is very thick. It's an inch thick, and it's very difficult to take out, right? So you either want to go all the way, where you're taking everything out, or you want to just not touch that ceiling ever and figure out some way that you could do your remodel, because it is a nightmare to work with.
Okay, well, that's kind of cool. But as far as you being like if a person's looking to do a project, you know these ins and outs, right? You know what I mean? Like, I see a lot of people who are like, you know, contractors who. Sacramento is very area specific, like I mentioned. Like we were talking, I'm like, well, what did we say? 6 things to, and you're like, no. This is Land Park, and so it's nice to work with someone who knows the various areas, things to watch out for, and it's a different expense in different areas as well for flips and upgrades and all that fun stuff.
And this
right?
may sound self-serving, but if I'm buying a Land Park home, me, homeowner, not contractor, I'm probably going to be tearing almost everything down into the studs.
Yeah.
Right? I'm going to be avoiding my risks with all of what we talked about before with fire hazards. I'm also going to be putting in modern materials that make sense. I'm going to get rid of all that lath and plaster. So I would highly recommend, if you're going to buy a home, think about maybe a third of what you paid for that home into the remodeling. And so if you're buying $1 million home out here in Land Park, maybe consider $300,000 into the home, or $200,000 into it. And I would say if you have the option to buy a $1.5 million home that needs a lot of work, and that's your cap, maybe consider buying that 1.1, 1.2, right? And making it your own, because you could have an issue down the line where, you know, there are fires that happen in this neighborhood. There are issues where you go to sell that house or you can't insure it because you have the Zinsco panel, and now you're into it and you're going, well, I can afford my mortgage, but I'm living in this money trap. So,
yeah. Well, the other thing too is to note is like, if you can do the remodel before you move into the house.
Bingo.
And
A lot less stress.
A lot less stress, and yeah, that's what I did when I purchased my home. Threw my keys to my contractors, and I said, "Hey, I'll see you in a month." It was good. And this is
Amen.
before we started talking, or else I would have, of course, used you. All right, so here's another thing too: new homes, resale homes, whatever you're buying. I mean, like, what do you think about third-party inspections? Because even new homes, I'm telling my clients, like, if it's a big investment, $500-$600 for a third-party inspector is a good way to go. Because Land Park is what Land Park is, what do you think about third-party inspectors as far as this goes?
I wouldn't buy a house without one. I would say that a third-party inspection is critical in this neighborhood, and you need to really get an inspector that you trust.
Yeah.
You need to look at some of his past reports. You need to talk to a couple realtors and maybe say, hey, look, what do you think about this guy? You know, really get the skinny on him, because you could have an issue that costs you $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 that you didn't even think of. And so it's important you get a guy who's going to go down in the crawl space. We had a project one time out here on, I think, 14th, where they had asbestos around the HVAC ducts in the crawl space. Well, the inspector said, oh, it was just debris, right? Some white debris. That was what they put in the inspection report. So the homeowner bought the house, didn't have the opportunity to counteroffer and say, hey, we have to have asbestos abatement here. And $20,000, $30,000 later, you know, the asbestos was removed by a professional that's licensed to do that, right? So one little miss from that inspector cost that client almost $30,000.
If someone is looking to do a inspection, I mean, you know, you got to definitely view you know, you got to vet your inspector for sure.
100%.
I mean, 100%. You got to check Google reviews. You just got to do it with builders as well too, and with contractors, with realtors. I mean, this is the day where so many people put stuff online that you can dig. If you dig far enough, you can find out anything about anybody. And I think that due diligence, especially when you're buying something that is as expensive as a house, I mean, like, this is the most stressful purchase you're probably gonna have in your life. Like, do the diligence, do the extra work. Don't just rely on other people to tell you, hey, I'm good. You know, like, do the work. And at the end of the day, you'll sleep a little bit better, and you'll feel like you did everything you needed to do to get you where you needed to be. You know what I mean?
That's right.
All right, Dan, any parting words for everybody regarding Land Park, regarding like remodels, regarding buying in this area? Anything fun about Land Park? Anything?
Okay, so have you heard the phrase, when was the best time to build a tree or plant a tree? 25 years ago. Well, Land Park, they've planted the trees 100 years ago. So you have this invaluable asset in your front yard. It just looks amazing. Come out here, check out the home, spend a couple Saturdays with Mark, and tour the neighborhood. And I think you're going to love it. And give me a call if you need a remodel.
There we go. Guys, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Like I said, we're here in Land Park. We're checking out Land Park's right over there. Dan's job's right over here. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, and subscribe. Reach out to our team too if you're thinking about moving to the area or you're thinking about selling your home. Now, if you want some more videos to watch, we got one right here. And also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, guys, this is Mark with Dan. We're out of here.